Watch what happens to your breathing right now. Slow down. Notice how your attention naturally wants to scan the room, looking for microtensions, shifting body language, or unsaid tension in the air. If you are an empath, you have spent your entire life operating like a human radar dish with the gain dialed up to maximum. You walk into a room, and within 4 seconds, your autonomic nervous system picks up the hidden resentment between two coworkers, the suppressed panic of a partner, or the predatory focus of someone sizing up the perimeter. You didn't ask for this baseline. It was wired into you, often through early environmental conditioning, where reading microexpressions was a matter of basic emotional survival. But here is the brutal truth that nobody in the mainstream self-help world wants to admit. An uncalibrated empath is not enlightened. An uncalibrated empath is an open system bleeding energy into every psychological vacuum around them. You have likely been told that your sensitivity is your, quote, superpower. Yet if we look at the clinical reality, it is repeatedly felt like a structural vulnerability. You attract manipulators, psychological parasites, and broken personalities who treat your nervous system like an unpaid charging station. You absorb their grief, excuse their betrayals, and confuse their dysfunction with your responsibility. You give and give until your psychological immune system collapses. Then comes the deep suffering. Not a bad week or a standard heartbreak, but the catastrophic break. The betrayal so surgically precise, or the burnout so profound, that every coping mechanism you ever relied on shatters into dust. You find yourself lying on the floor, stripped of your identity, realizing that being, quote, nice was actually a sophisticated trauma response. Most people believe deep suffering destroys an empath. That is an amateur assessment. In behavioral science and human mechanics, extreme pressure either shatters a structure or forces a complete architectural overhaul. If you stay with this breakdown until the very end, you will understand the exact neurological and behavioral shift that occurs when an empath stops being prey. You are going to learn why that catastrophic pain wasn't designed to make you bitter. It was the exact crucible required to burn away your need for external validation, strip away your naive compliance, and turn your raw sensitivity into the most lethal tool of discernment on the planet. If you leave now, you will keep running the old loop. If you stay, you will see the exact blueprint of who you become on the other side. Most people look at human behavior through a romantic lens. They want to believe that kindness is naturally rewarded and that emotional openness is universally respected. Anyone who has worked in high-stakes human profiling knows the opposite is true. The human animal is driven by baseline survival, dominance, and resource extraction. When a highly sensitive, perceptive individual enters the world without tactical boundaries, they do not get rewarded. They get exploited. An untrained empath operates with zero operational security. You feel what someone else feels, and your immediate instinct is to fix it, soothe it, or absorb it so the ambient tension drops. You mistake their chaos for your assignment. You tell yourself you are just being compassionate, but at a behavioral level, you are running an appeasement loop. You are trying to regulate their emotional state so your own nervous system can finally feel safe. That strategy works until it meets a high-order manipulator or a prolonged crisis. When deep suffering hits, when you face systemic betrayal, chronic exploitation, or complete psychological exhaustion, the appeasement loop fails catastrophically. The pain is not superficial. It cuts straight to the core identity. You realize that your endless understanding did not change the toxic behavior around you. It only enabled it. This is the critical inflection point. When an empath goes through profound suffering, a neurological rewiring takes place. The illusion that everyone has the same heart as you is eradicated. You stop projecting your own integrity onto people who operate entirely on predatory instincts. The blindfold comes off, and for the first time, You see human behavior for what it actually is: a series of observable micro-behaviors, baseline shifts, and incentive structures. Suffering strips away the compulsion to save everyone. You begin to understand the difference between empathy as a reaction and empathy as a tool. An untrained empath is like an actor who steps on stage and forgets they are acting. They absorb the tragedy of every character until they break down. A transformed empath becomes the director. You see the script. You observe the body language, the vocal cadence, the micro-expressions, and the hidden agendas. You perceive the exact emotional temperature of the room with absolute precision. But you no longer let that energy cross your internal perimeter. You develop an emotional firewall. You no longer rush in to fill awkward silences. You stop offering explanations to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop managing other people's discomfort. Your silence becomes heavy, calibrated, and deliberate. When someone attempts to manipulate you using guilt or victimhood, you don't absorb the projection. You watch the mechanics of their tactic with cold, clinical clarity. Deep suffering does not make an empath cruel. Cruelty is a sign of weakness and unhealed pain. Instead, suffering makes an empath dangerous to manipulators and invaluable to the honest. It turns a fragile, overwhelmed sensor into a grounded, sovereign observer. You retain your ability to feel deeply, but you gain the discipline to decide when, where, and to whom that access is granted. You walk away from the fire transformed. The world didn't get softer, but you became unshakable. When we look at human mechanics from a cold behavioral standpoint, the untrained empath is operating with a biological anomaly that nobody properly prepared them for. The average person walks through life with a natural neurological firewall. They register another human being's frustration, anger, or despair, but that information hits an internal perimeter and stays external. It is processed as an objective observation. That person is angry. For an empath, that perimeter simply does not exist at baseline. The incoming data bypasses cognitive evaluation entirely and fires directly into the autonomic nervous system. You don't just observe the tension in a room. Your body instantly mirrors the physiological state of the people producing it. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing becomes shallow, and your vagal tone drops without your conscious consent. This is what we call an involuntary antenna running on open-loop biological resonance. In high-level behavioral profiling, an open-loop system is one that continuously accepts external inputs without an internal regulator to filter, reject, or isolate the feed. You are effectively walking around with a high-gain microphone pointed at the entire room, capturing every frequency of human distress, suppressed malice, micro-anxiety, and hostility. Most people assume that empathy is an intellectual or purely emotional choice, something you turn on when you want to connect with a friend. For the empath, it is a continuous, non-stop sensory stream running in the background of their daily existence, draining their cognitive battery before they even speak a word. The fundamental danger of this involuntary antenna is not just sensory overload. It is the immediate, subconscious drive to resolve the signal. When your nervous system absorbs someone else's dysregulation, your primitive brain interprets that ambient tension as a direct threat to your own survival. If the environment is unstable, you are unstable. Consequently, the empath develops an automatic, deeply ingrained behavioral habit of managing the room. You start tracking micro-expressions, shifts in vocal cadence, and postural changes not out of idle curiosity, but as a hyper-vigilant attempt to neutralize threats before they escalate. You rush to soothe someone's unspoken irritation. You adjust your own behavior to keep an unpredictable person calm, and you constantly smooth over rough social edges. You mistake this process for genuine altruism or an innate gift, but from a behavioral mechanics perspective, it is an exhausting, continuous survival loop designed to stop the antenna from screaming. Because there is no internal barrier separating self from other, the empath begins to carry psychological weight that belongs entirely to other people. You internalize the shame of a partner, the chronic victimhood of a friend, or the covert hostility of a colleague, processing those external toxins through your own physical body. The liver detoxifies chemicals. The empath's nervous system tries to detoxify psychological pollution. This open-loop state guarantees long-term systemic fatigue. You are constantly running background applications that do not belong to you, bleeding mental clarity, emotional bandwidth, and physical vitality into an environment that will gladly take every drop you offer without offering a single ounce of real protection in return. Every human system operates on a finite energetic budget, but an untrained empath consistently behaves as though they have an infinite reserve of psychological currency. When an empath encounters a dysregulated individual, a narcissist, a chronic victim, or someone caught in active self-destruction, they do not merely witness the breakdown. They step directly into the blast radius and attempt to act as a human shock absorber. The subconscious calculation running beneath the surface is simple and flawed. If I can supply enough validation, enough patience, and enough emotional stability, the external chaos will finally quiet down. What the empath fails to understand from a structural standpoint is that you cannot fill a bottomless pit with your own living tissue. This dynamic inevitably leads to what behavioral analysts recognize as the catastrophic tipping point. When you offer emotional labor to an individual or an environment that operates purely on extraction, no equilibrium is ever reached. Instead, an asymmetrical dependency forms. The other person begins to treat your calm, regulated state as an open resource to exploit, while projecting their unprocessed hostility, shame, and disorder directly onto your perimeter. Because the empath believes their primary value lies in their capacity to hold space and endure discomfort for others, they double down. They make excuses for baseline disrespect. They rationalize away glaring micro-behaviors of manipulation, and they internalize the blame whenever the volatile person predictably destabilizes again. The physical and psychological architecture can only sustain this degree of asymmetrical strain for so long before structural failure occurs. You begin to see clear biological indicators of a system running far past redline. Sleep architecture fragments because the central nervous system remains locked in a sympathetic fight-or-flight freeze loop. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis becomes chronically flooded, leading to adrenal exhaustion, cognitive brain fog, and an inability to track basic everyday patterns. The empath enters a state of persistent depletion, where their own emotional range flattens into numbness, punctuated only by sudden spikes of overwhelming panic. You are pouring water from a cracked, empty pitcher into an engine that is intentionally designed to overheat. The ultimate breaking point arrives when the empath experiences the total collapse of their primary defense mechanism, the illusion of control through appeasement. It typically manifests as an undeniable betrayal, a profound abandonment in a moment of acute need, or a complete nervous breakdown where the body physically refuses to carry the load any longer. In that specific moment, the entire framework shatters. The realization hits with surgical, devastating clarity that all those years of emotional sacrifice, hypervigilance, and self-abandonment did not heal a single soul, fix a single broken dynamic, or earn an ounce of authentic loyalty. It only served to hollow out the host. The empath is left completely isolated, staring at the raw wreckage of a self-inflicted psychological bankruptcy, realizing that the house they spent years building for others was constructed entirely from the timber of their own spine. When structural failure occurs and the illusion of saving others collapses, an essential neurological pivot begins. Up until this point in an empath's life, empathy has functioned almost entirely as an identity, a core moral definition of self that is inextricably linked to vulnerability, emotional absorption, and passive compliance. You believed that feeling everything deeply and unconditionally was simply who you were. But after the catastrophic burn of deep suffering, the brain is forced to conduct an emergency operational review. The baseline assumption that hyperpermeability equals moral goodness is shattered by the raw survival instinct of the organism. The central nervous system realizes that continuing to operate as an open biological conduit will result in complete psychological annihilation. This realization triggers a profound shift in cognitive architecture. Empathy transitions from an identity-based vulnerability into a calibrated sensory skill. In behavioral analysis, a skill is something you control, direct, and deploy intentionally, whereas a compulsive trait is something that controls you. In the uncalibrated state, incoming emotional signals fire straight into the limbic system, triggering instantaneous visceral reactions, boundary erosion, and autonomic distress. During the neurological pivot, a functional prefrontal barrier is erected. The incoming emotional data from another human being, their covert agitation, their suppressed grief, their performative victimhood, is intercepted by the executive, analytical centers of the brain before it can flood the nervous system. You begin to observe the exact same emotional frequencies you used to drown in, but now you view them through an objective, analytical lens. Instead of asking yourself, "How do I fix this feeling?" or "Why does this hurt me so much?" your cognitive framework switches to, "What is this behavioral data telling me about the baseline, incentives, and operational stability of this individual?" The emotional input stops being a call to personal action and becomes pure situational intelligence. You no longer mistake someone else's emotional storm for your own weather system. You see the storm, you calculate its trajectory, you measure its intensity, but you remain entirely sheltered behind a reinforced psychological partition. This pivot fundamentally rewires how mirror neurons interface with conscious awareness. Rather than engaging in involuntary autonomic mirroring, where your heart rate and respiration unconsciously match the dysregulated person in front of you, you maintain deliberate physiological sovereignty. You hold your own breathing cadence steady. You keep your own muscular baseline relaxed and grounded. You allow the raw emotional cues of the other person to exist as external data points on a screen, rather than toxins injected into your bloodstream. Empathy is no longer an open wound that forces you to bleed for strangers. It transforms into a high-precision, tactical instrument of perception that operates strictly under your command, activated only when you choose to grant access, and deactivated the moment a boundary is approached. Once the prefrontal barrier is established, the transformed empath begins constructing an entirely new behavioral interface with the outside world: tactical detachment. For years, the primary driver behind an empath's social interactions was a subconscious need for harmony through appeasement. You were conditioned to believe that maintaining connection required total accessibility, rapid responses, and constant emotional accommodation. Tactical detachment shatters that dynamic entirely. It is not an act of cold hostility or emotional shutdown. Rather, it is the deliberate application of strategic distance, operational boundaries, and objective pattern analysis. You replace the naive, codependent impulse to comply with a clinical framework designed to evaluate human behavior in real time. In human profiling and behavioral dynamics, an individual who cannot be provoked, baited, or rushed into an emotional reaction holds the highest level of situational control. When an empath integrates tactical detachment, the immediate urge to rescue someone from their own discomfort vanishes. You stop jumping into the conversational void to ease an awkward silence. You stop rushing to validate someone who is performing calculated helplessness. When another person attempts to deploy standard compliance tactics, such as guilt-tripping, manufactured urgency, or passive-aggressive micro-expressions, you do not internalize the projection. Instead, you step back internally and track the mechanics of the maneuver. You watch the sudden shift in their vocal pitch, the asymmetrical facial tension, the strategic pause designed to elicit an apology, and you treat it as pure diagnostic data rather than an emotional crisis. This operational shield fundamentally alters the way an empath processes social transactions. In the past, whenever a predatory or highly narcissistic individual pushed against a boundary, the empath would negotiate, over-explain, and offer extensive rationalizations for why they couldn't comply. That behavior signals weakness and low boundary strength to a skilled manipulator. With tactical detachment, the empath's responses become concise, grounded, and unyielding. You no longer hand over the emotional keys to your internal state. You deliver a clean, neutral no without an attached defense dossier. You hold direct, unbroken eye contact with a calm, resting facial baseline that offers zero emotional leverage for the other person to hook into. By removing the involuntary emotional feedback loop, you effectively starve psychological parasites of their primary fuel source. Chronic manipulators rely entirely on eliciting strong, predictable reactions: confusion, guilt, panic, or defensive over-explaining, in order to steer their targets into submission. When they push a button and encounter a calm, detached observer who merely watches them work without flinching, the dynamic breaks down instantly. The manipulator becomes dysregulated because their tactical playbook no longer yields a return on investment. The empath ceases to be an open target for energy extraction and instead becomes an unreadable mirror. You are no longer managing their emotional weather. You are simply maintaining your own climate, completely insulated from the external noise. The final stage of this evolution is the emergence of the sovereign empath, an individual who has completed the total structural overhaul from passive, wounded prey into a grounded, high-level behavioral observer. At this tier of development, you no longer identify with the fragile, romanticized archetype of the exhausted healer. You do not view your sensitivity as a curse that must be constantly managed, nor as an open door through which anyone can walk. Instead, you operate with absolute internal authority. You understand precisely how the human machinery around you functions, and you wield your deep perceptual capacity not as an emotional burden, but as an elite instrument of strategic discernment. A sovereign empath possesses what behavioral analysts call total operational autonomy. You walk into the exact same high-stakes rooms, navigate the exact same manipulative personalities, and witness the exact same emotional chaos that used to break your nervous system. But the internal dynamic is entirely inverted. You perceive every micro-expression, every subtle shift in breathing cadence, every mask slipping behind a forced smile, and every calculated bid for power. Your sensory fidelity has actually sharpened, but the critical difference is that none of that raw data penetrates your core. You observe everything. You absorb nothing. You are the immovable center in a room full of reactive motion. This sovereign state completely dismantles the typical predatory hierarchy. In standard human dynamics, covert narcissists, manipulators, and parasitic personalities seek out sensitive individuals because they expect high compliance, zero friction, and infinite forgiveness. When they encounter a sovereign empath, they walk into a psychological wall. The sovereign empath does not raise their voice, argue, or enter into petty emotional battles. They do not get pulled into manufactured drama because they have eradicated the naive assumption that everyone operates with good intentions. When a boundary is crossed, the response is swift, surgical, and entirely devoid of frantic emotion. The sovereign empath simply removes access. By cutting off the supply of emotional overfunctioning, the sovereign empath becomes essentially untouchable to standard psychological games. Your presence communicates a subtle, non-verbal weight that demands respect without a single aggressive posture. People naturally sense that their standard levers, guilt, flattery, manufactured chaos, passive aggression, have zero traction against your internal architecture. You reserve your profound capacity for genuine warmth, deep connection, and healing solely for environments and individuals who have demonstrated measurable consistency, emotional maturity, and mutual integrity. You have moved beyond the naive impulse to fix the entire world at the expense of your own existence. Empathy is no longer a chronic, bleeding wound that leaves you defenseless against the harshness of the human landscape. It has been forged into a diamond-hard lens of pure clarity. You stand fully integrated, completely aware of human darkness, yet entirely uncorrupted by it. Moving through life with the calm, dangerous certainty of someone who has walked directly through the crucible of their own destruction and emerged as the absolute master of their internal domain.